When Ryan Wesley Routh was sentenced to life in prison plus 84 months on February 4, 2026, most people assumed the story was over. The failed assassin, the man who hid in the bushes of a Florida golf course with an AK-style rifle pointed at the President of the United States, was finally going away forever. Case closed. Justice served. Move on. But I assure you, the real story lies in what happens next, in the hidden, suffocating, brutal details of what Ryan Routh's existence actually looks like now, every single hour of every single day. Behind walls, the media conveniently stops talking about the moment the sentencing gavel drops. Because here's the thing, being sent to federal prison for life isn't just a punishment. For a man like Ryan Routh, it is the beginning of something far more psychologically devastating than most people can even imagine. And today, we're going to walk through every single hour of his brutal 24-hour daily routine inside one of the most restrictive, most controlled, most psychologically crushing prison environments that exists on American soil. So if you think you already know what life looks like for Ryan Routh right now, I promise you don't. Stay with me, because what I'm about to break down is something most people never get to hear. But before we get into what Routh's daily existence actually looks like inside those walls, I need you to first understand who this man really is, how he got here, and why the system decided his crime deserved one of the most severe punishments the federal government can hand down, because that context is everything. Ryan Wesley Routh was born on February 18, 1966 in Greensboro, North Carolina. For most of his life, he was no one special. A construction worker, a small business owner, a man with a criminal record, yes, but nothing that would make you think he was capable of what he eventually attempted to do. He had prior convictions. In 2002, he barricaded himself inside a Honolulu roofing company while armed, leading to a standoff with police. He pleaded guilty, got probation, surrendered his weapons. Life went on. But somewhere along the way, Ryan Routh became obsessed. Obsessed with Ukraine, obsessed with politics, obsessed with the idea that he, one man from North Carolina with a rifle and a grudge, could change the course of history. And on September 15, 2024, he tried. That morning, Routh woke up with a plan he had been building for months. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a moment of rage. If you do the math on the timeline alone, you can tell this was calculated, premeditated, and frighteningly patient. Between August 18th and September 15th, 2024, Routh's phone had accessed cell towers near Trump International Golf Club and the president's residence at Mar-a-Lago on multiple occasions, multiple trips, multiple surveillance runs. He had been watching, waiting, studying the routines of the Secret Service. He had dropped off a box at a witness's home in April 2024, months earlier, containing a handwritten letter addressed to the world that read, and I want you to hear this clearly, this was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, but I am so sorry I failed you. He wrote that letter before he even pulled the trigger. Now listen closely, because what I'm going to say next brings everything together. Routh didn't just show up that day with a pistol and a prayer. He showed up with a Norinco SKS rifle, equipped with a scope, a loaded magazine containing 19 rounds of ammunition, with one round already chambered, steel armor plates, which he had hung over the fence to protect himself, and a camera he had physically affixed to the fence and aimed directly at the 6th green, the hole where Donald Trump was about to play golf, just minutes away. He had built a sniper's nest, a hidden, fortified, premeditated sniper's nest on the edge of a presidential golf course. And he sat in that nest for hours, waiting. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean where the entire plan collapsed in the span of about 60 seconds. Secret Service Special Agent Robert Furcano was doing his job that morning. He was patrolling one hole ahead of the president, which is standard protocol, clearing the area before Trump arrived. And when Agent Furcano moved along the fence line bordering the course, he spotted something that shouldn't have been there. A face, partially obscured, pressed against the chain-link fence, and the barrel of a rifle pointed directly at him. Agent Furcano didn't hesitate. With a gun aimed at his face, he drew his weapon and fired several rounds from his pistol before taking cover behind a tree and immediately radioing in the threat. The president, one hole back and just minutes away, never came close to the line of fire. Routh ran. He fled the scene, crossed a roadway, and jumped into a black Nissan Xterra. But a civilian, an ordinary citizen named Tommy McGee, saw him, wrote down the license plate number, and contacted law enforcement. Officers from the Martin County Sheriff's Office, assisted by Palm Beach County, stopped Routh traveling northbound on I-95. Inside his vehicle, they found multiple mobile phones, a list of international flights, and directions to Miami International Airport. He was running, and he almost made it. Now, while all of this was unfolding, the investigation that followed painted an even more disturbing picture. Prosecutors eventually revealed that Routh had conspired with former employees, a woman named Tina Brown Cooper and a man named Ronnie J. Oxendine, to illegally obtain the rifle he used that day. In July 2024, Routh had called Cooper, told her he was coming to Greensboro, and told her he needed help buying a gun. Cooper reached out to Oxendine. On August 2, 2024, they met at Oxendine and Son Roofing Company, and the weapon changed hands. That weapon would eventually be pointed at a sitting president of the United States. Routh was indicted on 5 federal charges. He pleaded not guilty to all of them. And then, in one of the most chaotic legal decisions in the history of this case, Routh fired his public defenders in July 2025 and decided to represent himself at trial. That trial began on September 8, 2025, in Fort Pierce, Florida, before U.S. District Judge Aileen Cannon. And if you thought the crime itself was dramatic, the trial was something else entirely. Routh was constantly reprimanded by Judge Cannon throughout the proceedings. He addressed witnesses without permission. He went off script. He turned the courtroom into a stage for his grievances about Ukraine and Gaza instead of mounting any coherent legal defense. 2 weeks later, on September 23, 2025, the jury came back with their verdict. Guilty on all 5 federal counts. Guilty of attempted assassination of a major presidential candidate. Guilty of assault on a federal law enforcement officer. Guilty on multiple firearms charges. And then, in what can only be described as one of the most disturbing moments ever witnessed in a federal courtroom, as the verdict was being read aloud, Ryan Wesley Routh reached over, grabbed a pen, and attempted to stab himself in the neck. He was tackled by U.S. Marshals before he could do serious damage. He was moved to the medical unit at St. Lucie County Jail under suicide observation. The sentencing was scheduled, then delayed, then finally set for February 4, 2026. On that day, Routh was brought into court shackled at his hands and feet, dressed in a tan prison jumpsuit. He was told to remain seated when he addressed Judge Cannon. He spoke about Ukraine. He spoke about Gaza. And then he said something that I think tells you everything you need to know about this man's psychology. He looked at the judge and said, "Nothing stands before you but a hollow American shell. Sadly, execution is not an option." Judge Cannon had heard enough. "Your plot to kill is deliberate and evil despite your feigned peacefulness," she said. "You demonstrated your intent to kill. You almost achieved your evil plan." And then she handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 months, 7 years for the firearms conviction. Ryan Wesley Routh, 59 years old at the time of sentencing, will never be a free man again. He will die inside a federal prison. That is now a mathematical certainty. But here's the part that might actually interest you, because the sentence itself is just the beginning of the story. The real question, the one nobody in the mainstream media actually sits down and answers, is this: what does that life actually look like? What does Ryan Routh wake up to every single morning? What does he eat? What does he see? What does he hear? What fills the hours of a man who will never walk free again? Let's get into it. Hour by hour, minute by minute. You see, to understand what Ryan Routh's daily routine looks like, you need to understand the environment he's living inside. And I mean really understand it, not in a vague, it's a tough prison kind of way, but in a specific, concrete, visceral way that makes it real. The cell that houses a man serving life in a maximum security federal penitentiary is approximately 7 feet wide and 12 feet long. That is roughly the size of a standard parking space. Inside that space is a concrete bed slab with a thin mattress, a small desk bolted to the wall, a toilet and sink combination unit, and a narrow window so narrow and positioned so specifically that all it reveals is a slice of sky. Not the ground, not the yard, not another human being, just sky. The walls are poured concrete, not drywall, not cinder block. Poured concrete, specifically engineered to prevent any possibility of digging, breaking, or manipulating the structure in any way. The door is steel. The slot in the door, the only opening through which food enters and hands can technically exit, is just wide enough to pass a food tray through. That is the world Ryan Routh wakes up in every single morning. Now here's where it gets real. The day at a federal maximum security facility begins at approximately 6 a.m. Not because of an alarm clock Routh controls, not because he decided he was ready to wake up, because the institution says so. A buzzer sounds, lights come on, and the first thing that happens, before breakfast, before anything, is a head count. Guards walk the unit, visually confirming that every inmate is present and accounted for. This happens multiple times a day, every day, without exception. You are counted when you wake up. You are counted before meals. You are counted after meals. You are counted in the afternoon. You are counted before lights out. You are counted in the middle of the night. The message is clear, and it is intentional. You are not a person here. You are a number. You are inventory, and the inventory must be verified at all times. After the morning count, Routh has a window of time for what the Bureau of Prisons calls personal hygiene. Now understand what that actually means in this context. Showers are not a daily occurrence. Inmates at maximum security federal facilities are permitted to shower approximately 3 times per week. On days when a shower is not scheduled, personal hygiene is limited to what can be accomplished at the sink inside the cell itself. A face wash, teeth brushing. That's the extent of it. Think about that for a second. This is a man who, from all accounts, had some degree of freedom to move around the world, who traveled, who worked, who had a life, however troubled it was. And now the act of taking a shower is a scheduled privilege that happens 3 times a week. Breakfast arrives at the cell door at approximately 7 a.m. And when I say it arrives at the cell door, I mean it is passed through the slot. A tray, slid through a narrow opening in a steel door by a guard who may or may not acknowledge Routh's existence in any meaningful way. The food itself is standard Bureau of Prisons institutional fare. It meets federal nutritional requirements, accommodates religious dietary needs including halal and kosher designations, but it is not something anyone would describe as a meal you'd look forward to. Oatmeal, bread, a piece of fruit if he's fortunate, some form of protein he eats alone, in his cell, sitting on his concrete bed, or at his small bolted desk. There is no dining hall, no table with other people, no conversation over a meal, just Routh, a tray, 4 concrete walls, and whatever thoughts happened to be running through his mind that morning. Now here's something no one actually talks about in the coverage of high-profile inmates: the silence. The profound, unbroken, psychologically suffocating silence that fills the hours between scheduled events. Because after breakfast is done and the tray is collected through the slot, there is nothing. There is no mandatory activity until the next scheduled event, and that next event might not happen for hours. What does Routh do in that silence? According to what we know about life inside federal maximum security facilities, the options are extremely limited. If he has books, which inmates can receive through approved channels, he can read. He can write using rubber-tipped pens that are specifically designed so they cannot be used as weapons. He can exercise in whatever way the 7 by 12 foot space allows. Push-ups, sit-ups, pacing, back and forth across a space so small that a man of average height can cross it in 4 steps. He can, after an initial adjustment period, access a small black and white television set mounted inside the cell, tuned to a limited number of approved channels. He can listen to a radio. But here's the disturbing detail: these are not luxuries freely given. They are privileges earned through compliance and behavior. A man who acts out, who violates rules, who causes problems, loses those privileges. The television disappears, the radio goes away, and all that's left is the silence and the concrete. By mid-morning, the cell cleaning requirement kicks in. Inmates are expected to keep their cells in a certain state of order. This is not optional. Guards conduct inspections, and a cell that fails inspection can result in consequences. So Routh, whether he wants to or not, spends time each morning maintaining the physical space of his confinement, folding the blanket a specific way, ensuring the desk is clear, keeping the toilet and sink clean. Think about the psychology of that. The institution is not just controlling where Routh goes. It is controlling how his immediate physical environment is arranged. Every corner of his existence, what he eats, when he sleeps, when he showers, how his room looks, is dictated by a system that has made a deliberate decision to strip autonomy from every possible aspect of daily life. But ironically, that structure, as oppressive as it sounds, is also the thing that keeps men in long-term isolation from losing their minds entirely. Having something to do, even something as mundane as cleaning a cell, gives the brain a task, a purpose, a small anchor to reality. Without it, the research on long-term solitary adjacent confinement is absolutely clear. The human mind begins to deteriorate. Hallucinations, paranoia, severe depression, anxiety that becomes physically debilitating. Lunch arrives through the slot at approximately 11:30 a.m. to noon, again a tray, through a slot eaten alone. The meal is slightly more substantial than breakfast, perhaps a sandwich or hot entree, a side, and a drink. The entire act of eating takes perhaps 15 minutes, and then the tray is collected, and the silence resumes. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this is the part of the day that most people, when they imagine prison, picture completely differently from reality: the 1 hour of recreation. In people's minds, prison recreation looks like what you see in movies. A yard with guys lifting weights, playing basketball, socializing, catching some sun. Maybe some light drama, some politics, some alliances being formed. That image, that Hollywood image, has absolutely nothing to do with what recreation looks like for a man of Ryan Routh's classification. At a maximum security federal penitentiary, when Routh's recreation hour comes, and it is exactly 1 hour, not a minute more, he is first prepared for transport. That means guards arrive at his cell door. He presents his hands through the slot in the door, and he is handcuffed. Then the door opens, and he is shackled at the ankles. And then, in a detail that I think perfectly captures just how controlled this environment truly is, he is also shackled at the stomach. Wrists, ankles, waist, all chained together. Guards flank him on both sides. And then he is walked, shuffled. Really? Because the ankle shackles limit his stride to the recreation area. And when he arrives at that recreation area, what does he find? A concrete enclosure, high walls on all sides, an open top so that sky is visible above. No grass, no equipment, no other inmates. Just a concrete pen that former inmates and inspectors have described as resembling a dog kennel or a cage. You might be able to walk 10 steps in a straight line before you hit a wall. If he wants to exercise, he does calisthenics. Jumping jacks if the shackles allow. Some form of movement in a space so small that calling it a yard would be almost comedic if the reality of it weren't so grim. To put into context just how suffocating this is, the recreation enclosure is barely larger than the cell he just came from. He has traded one concrete box for a slightly different concrete box, with sky visible above him. That is the sum total of his daily outdoor experience. And that 1 hour? It's not guaranteed. Records and inspection reports have confirmed that recreation time at maximum security facilities can be cut short or eliminated entirely with minimal notice, meaning Routh can go multiple consecutive days without ever leaving his cell at all, without ever feeling air that isn't recycled through a ventilation system, without ever seeing anything other than 4 concrete walls and a sliver of sky through a narrow window. After recreation, Routh is shackled again, walked back to his cell, and the door closes behind him. The afternoon stretches out, hours of it, more silence, more limited options. If he has access to the television, he watches whatever is available on the approved channels. If he is enrolled in one of the facility's education programs, a GED course, an English as a second language class, an adult basic education module, that programming comes through the television screen in his cell. There is no classroom. There is no teacher standing in front of a group of students. There is a screen in a cell, broadcasting educational content to a man sitting alone. The educational programs available are genuinely limited. There is no vocational training in the traditional sense. There is no work assignment. At ADX Florence and comparable maximum security units, there are no jobs for most inmates in the way that lower security federal prisons have jobs: kitchen duty, groundskeeping, laundry. Those things don't exist for men at this classification level. There is no labor, there is no productive output, there is just time, and the slow, grinding pressure of that time passing. Dinner arrives through the slot at approximately 4:30 to 5 p.m. The same ritual as every other meal. Tray through the slot, eating alone, tray collected, another count conducted, and then the evening begins. The evening is, by most accounts of men who have lived through long-term federal incarceration at this level, the hardest part of the day. Because in the morning, there is at least the structure of the routine to get through: the count, the hygiene, the cleaning, the meals, the recreation hour. The evening has none of that structure. It is simply hours. Hours between dinner and lights out, with nothing required of Routh and nothing available to him beyond whatever internal world he has managed to construct. Some men read for hours in the evening. Some write, and writing is something Routh has already demonstrated a fondness for, given the handwritten letters he produced before his arrest. Some do physical exercise, some sit, some pace. Some, according to those who study the psychological effects of this kind of confinement, begin to talk to themselves, not out of madness necessarily, but out of a desperate human need to hear a voice, even if it's their own. The phone call. Let's talk about the phone call, because it is perhaps the most psychologically loaded moment in any given month inside a federal penitentiary. Inmates at maximum security facilities are permitted, if they are behaving, 1 phone call per month. 1 call, 15 minutes. That is the extent of Routh's permitted verbal contact with the outside world on a monthly basis. Think about what that means. A 15-minute phone call once a month is Ryan Routh's entire auditory connection to a world that has moved on without him. And that call is monitored, recorded, potentially used as evidence in any future legal proceedings. So even those 15 minutes, those precious, limited, monthly 15 minutes, cannot be truly free or truly private. Visitation is similarly restricted. Physical visits from approved individuals are permitted, but tightly controlled. They happen through glass, with no physical contact. The visitor sits on one side, Routh sits on the other, and they communicate through a telephone handset while looking at each other through a pane of separation. There are no hugs, there are no handshakes, there is no human touch of any kind, because at this classification level, even controlled physical contact with visitors is not typically permitted. The disturbing detail here is what long-term researchers and psychologists have documented about this level of human isolation. A law professor named Laura Rovner, who has represented inmates at America's most restrictive federal facility, described it as a kind of living death. Her words, not mine. A living death. Because the body continues to function. The heart keeps beating. The lungs keep breathing. But everything that makes human life meaningful, connection, purpose, autonomy, touch, spontaneity, the ability to choose, has been systematically removed. And here's something no one actually talks about. When they cover Ryan Routh's sentencing, the man asked for this. Not the sentence, but in a deeply disturbing way, he almost seemed to court the magnitude of it. At his sentencing, he told Judge Cannon that execution wasn't an option, but seemed to imply he might prefer it. He filed a motion before sentencing, asking a federal judge to recommend he be imprisoned either in a state that authorized assisted suicide or to be traded as a prisoner to Iran or China. Iran or China? He wanted to be traded to Iran or China rather than serve his sentence in an American prison. That motion tells you something profound about how Ryan Routh perceived what was coming for him. He knew. He understood that a life sentence in federal prison wasn't going to look like the prison life you see on television. He understood it was going to be something far more severe than that. And he decided he would rather be in the custody of a foreign adversary nation. The judge denied the motion. Routh went to federal prison anyway. Now understand what the nights look like. Lights out in federal penitentiaries typically occurs around 10 p.m. The lights in the cell dim, though they never go fully dark because complete darkness creates security concerns. There is always some ambient light in the cell, always, which means Routh sleeps, or attempts to sleep, in a room that is never truly dark. And sleep, it turns out, is one of the most significant psychological battlegrounds in long-term federal incarceration. Studies on men in extended confinement at high-security facilities consistently show disrupted sleep patterns, difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, night terrors, hypervigilance, the body remaining in a state of alert even during rest because the environment is never truly safe feeling, never truly quiet because it isn't quiet. A federal penitentiary is never quiet. There are sounds at all hours. The mechanical sounds of the facility itself, ventilation systems, locking mechanisms, the distant clang of steel doors, the sounds of other inmates, coughing, pacing, occasionally yelling into the void of their own isolation, and the sounds of guards conducting their counts, walking the unit, shining flashlights through the small window in the cell door to confirm that the inventory is still where it's supposed to be. At 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., a light sweeps across the cell. A face appears briefly at the door window, and then it moves on to the next cell, and the next. Routh is counted in his sleep or in whatever state of rest he has managed to achieve, and then the footsteps recede down the corridor, and the sounds of the facility fill the silence again, and the night continues. And then, at 6 a.m., the cycle begins again. This is the life of Ryan Wesley Routh. Not for a month, not for a year, not for a decade, forever. But here's the thing that I think people miss when they talk about sentences like Routh's, and I want you to really sit with this for a moment, because it gets to the core of why this punishment is designed the way it is. The human mind is extraordinarily adaptable. People can endure things that seem unendurable. History is full of examples of men and women who survived circumstances that should have broken them. And that adaptability, that resilience, is precisely what makes a life sentence in a maximum security federal facility so specifically, deliberately calculated. Because it's not designed to break you quickly. It's designed to last forever. The Bureau of Prisons operates on what is called a step-down system, a structured 3-year program through which inmates can theoretically earn their way to slightly less restrictive conditions through consistent good behavior. In the most restrictive facilities, an inmate begins at the maximum control level and can work their way towards slightly more human interaction, slightly more programming, slightly more contact with others over the course of years of compliance. But here's the thing about Ryan Routh specifically. He is 59 years old. His sentence is life without the possibility of parole. There is no release date. There is no goal to work toward in the way that an inmate with a defined sentence might work toward. Even if Routh earns his way through the step-down program over years of good behavior, he doesn't earn his freedom. He earns slightly better conditions for the rest of his life, which will still end inside a federal prison. According to multiple sources tracking the case, Routh is currently serving his sentence at United States Penitentiary Victorville in Victorville, California. USP Victorville is a high-security federal penitentiary, not a supermax, but a facility at the upper end of the federal prison security spectrum, housing some of the most serious federal offenders in the country. The conditions there, while not identical to the most extreme isolation protocols at a facility like ADX Florence, are still profoundly restrictive. Limited movement, controlled interaction, constant surveillance, a life that is measured in counts and meal slots and recreation hours, day after day after day. Now here's where it gets interesting from a broader perspective, because Routh isn't the first high-profile federal prisoner to face this kind of existence. And the way the system handles men like him tells us something significant about the philosophy behind American federal incarceration at the highest levels. Men who have attempted or succeeded in acts of political violence against major American figures have historically ended up in the most restrictive federal environments available. Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, is at ADX Florence. Zacarias Moussaoui, the 9/11 conspirator, was held there. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, was housed there. El Chapo, the Unabomber. The list of men who wake up in the same kind of concrete box, eating through the same kind of slot, counting the same kind of hours, it is a roster of some of the most dangerous and notorious individuals in recent American history. And Ryan Routh is now among them in terms of classification and sentence severity. The man who hid in the bushes of a Florida golf course with an AK-style rifle and a handwritten letter apologizing for failing the world, he now exists in the same institutional universe as terrorists, cartel bosses, and mass murderers. To put that into context, Routh wasn't successful. Trump was never in direct danger of being shot that day, because Agent Furcano cleared the area before the president arrived. Routh pointed a rifle at a Secret Service agent, not at Trump directly. And yet the sentence, the classification, and the conditions of his confinement are consistent with some of the most dangerous people ever housed in the American federal system. Why? Well, it all boils down to the nature of the crime. Attempted assassination of a major presidential candidate isn't just a violent crime. It's an attack on the democratic process itself. It's an attack on the concept of peaceful political transition. And the federal government, regardless of which administration is in power, treats that category of crime with a severity that goes beyond the physical act itself. Significantly more severe compared to what most people assume a failed attempt with no casualties would warrant. Now here's where it gets complicated. And I want to be honest with you about this because the question of whether the conditions Ryan Routh is living under represent justice or constitute something more troubling is one that serious legal scholars, human rights organizations, and former prison officials genuinely debate. If you take the time and do your homework, you can find out that the American Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International, and multiple law professors who specialize in prison conditions have raised sustained concerns about the psychological effects of long-term isolation in federal maximum security environments. The research is not ambiguous. Extended periods of extreme confinement, 22 to 24 hours a day in a cell with minimal human contact, produce measurable, documented, clinically recognized psychological damage. Former ADX Florence Warden Robert Hood, a man who spent more than 20 years in the Federal Bureau of Prisons and oversaw the Supermax from 2002 to 2005, described the experience of the inmates he supervised in terms that were striking, coming from someone whose job was to maintain that system. "It's a tomb, a mausoleum," he told reporters. "People are there to die." And then there are the inmates themselves, or at least the documentation of their experiences that has made it into the public record through legal proceedings and journalism. One former inmate described the reality with stark economy. "In cells for 24 hours a day, we only see staff when they feed us and pick up food trays. That's it. That's the totality of human contact on many days." But here's the part that creates genuine tension, because Ryan Routh chose this path. He planned for months. He built a rifle blind on a golf course. He wrote a letter apologizing for not killing the president. He stood in front of a federal judge and compared himself to a hollow shell while speaking about foreign wars. He tried to stab himself in the neck with a pen when the verdict was read. This is not a man who stumbled into catastrophe. This is a man who pursued it with deliberate, patient, documented intention. And the system, the same system that legal scholars critique for its psychological harshness, responded with exactly the kind of severity that the severity of the crime demanded. The only question left to answer right now is, what does the rest of Ryan Routh's life actually add up to? Other high-profile prisoners in similar situations have responded to decades of federal confinement in vastly different ways. Some have found religion. Some have written books, or attempted to, through the restricted correspondence systems available to them. Some have pursued legal appeals with a relentlessness that becomes the organizing principle of their confined existence. Some have deteriorated steadily, visibly, documented in court filings and medical records that paint a portrait of a human being slowly coming apart under the pressure of years without meaningful human connection. Routh's defense attorney has already signaled an intention to appeal, and that appeal process, which could take years, potentially many years, becomes, in a strange way, one of the few meaningful sources of purpose available to a man serving life without parole. The legal fight, the correspondence with attorneys, the filing of motions. Not because it's likely to succeed, but because it is something to do, a direction to face, a thing to care about in an environment that has been deliberately engineered to remove caring from the equation. But even if the appeals go nowhere, and most observers of federal criminal law expect they will go nowhere, it had a measurable impact on Routh's daily psychological state. Giving a man something to fight for, even a battle he is almost certain to lose, is the difference between a mind that retains some structure and a mind that has nothing left to organize around. And here's something no one actually talks about, While the sentence handed to Ryan Routh was historic in its severity for a case involving a failed attempt with no casualties, the prison conditions he is experiencing are not unique to him. They are the standard. They are the norm for thousands of men serving long federal sentences at high-security penitentiaries across the United States. Men whose names you have never heard, whose crimes were never covered on cable news, who wake up at 6 a.m. to a buzzer and a head count and a tray through a slot just like Ryan Routh does, and will continue to do for the rest of their lives. The difference is that Routh's crime was aimed at the most protected man in America. The consequence is that his name is attached to a case that will be studied, cited, and referenced in legal circles for decades. But the daily reality, the concrete, the slot, the shackles, the 1 hour of dog-run recreation, the 15-minute monthly phone call, the night counts with the flashlight sweeping through the window. That reality is shared by people across the entire federal high-security system. Ryan Wesley Routh attempted to change history on a golf course in West Palm Beach on September 15th, 2024. He failed. And now the rest of his history, every morning, every meal, every count, every hour, will be written inside a federal penitentiary, one day at a time, until there are no more days left to count. Routh's gone from the world he tried to upend, but we don't think his story is done being written. The appeals are coming. The years are coming. And somewhere inside a concrete cell in Victorville, California, the man who once sat in a rifle blind and waited for a president is now waiting for nothing at all. That's the real story. Not the sentencing hearing, not the verdict, not the dramatic moment with the pen. The real story is the 6 a.m. buzzer, the tray through the slot, the shackles for 1 hour in a concrete cage open to the sky, the 15-minute phone call once a month, the night count at 2 a.m. That is what Ryan Routh's life looks like now, every day, for the rest of his life.